This video is brought to you by Squarespace.
I have people living in my house. I don't know who they are, where they came from. Doors are gone, the kitchen has been gutted, and they won't leave. They won't leave.
The term squatter is a very controversial one. Freeloading criminals who break into people's homes, stealing them and leaving them in terrible conditions. But the history behind this strange subculture is a very unique one, challenging many moral and cultural attitudes.
This is a home, it can be used for home.
In today's video, we will explore the hated world of squatters.
No longer will there be the so-called squatters' rights.
Occupy everywhere!
First, the extraordinary standoff between a homeowner and a squatter. It's Julie's house, it's in her name, and she pays the mortgage. But for more than 2 years, Teresa Smith has been living there, slowly destroying it.
Now, growing up in the UK, I seem to constantly recall hearing stories of squatters. Like every other week, there'd be some news article about how squatters broke into someone's holiday home, which would then be followed by these lengthy court battles where they tried to evict them out of the property. And it seemed as if the law was on the side of the squatters as opposed to the property owners, and in some cases actually granting the property to the squatter. So if you're sat there wondering who came up with this genius law, well, this is all due to a thing known as squatters' rights, which the UK law states that a long-term squatter can become the registered owner of a property or land they've occupied without the owner's permission. Now, squatters exist all around the world, but I'm going to mainly focus on the UK, where if you were to ask Joe Average from the pub what his mental image of a squatter is, he's probably going to tell you something like a long-haired hippie with dreadlocks who reads The Guardian, hasn't taken a shower in months, uses copious drugs, refuses to work, and hates polite society. And look, that stereotype definitely carries some truth to it, but is really only the surface level of the squatting culture.
This is only one of many ex-army camps taken over by the thousands of ordinary, hard-working folk who haven't a place they can call their own.
And it all starts in medieval England, in a time where British nobles would be fighting over various massive plots of land. It became pretty tricky to keep on top of the paperwork, like which British noble owns what bit of land. And because these plots of lands were so big, there would be certain areas that would be known as common land. This was land that was kind of left for the common folk. Like, they didn't have direct ownership of the land, but they were allowed to use it. But you see, this presented a problem. All right, so let's put it like this. Imagine you're a family that has been on a plot of land for about 3 or 4 generations. And then one day you wake up to a knock on the door to find some great-great-great-great-grandson of a British noble wiggling some papers in your face saying that one of his great ancestors owned this land once upon a time. He then proceeds to tell your whole community to get off this property now, and you don't really have a legal leg to stand on. And so squatters' rights started with the intention of trying to stop this situation.
Trespassing? We, the common people, trespassing on common land which we own?
But then as time passed in the 16th and 17th century, movements such as the Levellers would come along with more of a political ideology. You see, these were squatters who believed that every human has a right to land.
The earth, sirs, was made to be a common treasury for all.
Unsurprisingly, this wasn't a popular belief in the feudal system, and so very quickly laws were passed to try and undo some of the squatters' rights. However, squatting in this era was a very small issue. It wasn't really causing much of a nuisance. But then everything would change after World War II. As 3.5 million female-deprived men returned from war to their lovely ladies, this would spark what would be known as the baby boom. With no new houses being built during the war and tons of buildings being demolished because of the war, Britain was like a busy dinner party with not enough chairs. And so Britain was in a housing crisis. In the 1945 election, this was the hot-button issue of the time.
So, if it's houses you're after,
every single political party had promised to build new houses. But would you believe it, these politicians didn't keep their promises.
I don't promise them tomorrow. No one can do that.
However, there was a small silver lining. Now that the war was over, there was many derelict buildings left, things such as ex-military bases. And so, out of necessity, a huge squatting movement started, involving ex-military men and their families.
This is only one of many ex-army camps taken over by the thousands of ordinary, hard-working folk who haven't a place they can call their own.
These families would occupy these derelict buildings in a kind of legal grey area, staying there all the way up until the mid-1950s. It was estimated across Britain there was 45,000 squatters. And like, what they were doing technically wasn't legal, but none of the political parties wanted to be known as the party that evicted war heroes onto the street. And so many of these squatting camps actually received funding from the government, with the left seeing it as a case for public housing, and the right seeing it as a batten down the hatches, take matters into your own hands kind of attitude. Squatters in this era were well received by the press and publicly celebrated as an expression of English patriotism.
At the other end of the scale, hundreds of homeless London families take matters into their own hands in a new squatters' invasion.
When in reality, it was just people trying not to live on the streets. But then the goodwill towards squatters would change very quickly. Before we crack on with this video, I want to give a shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring. Squarespace is the #1 platform for building and developing your own website. These days, having a good looking website is more important than ever. It can be quite literally the thing that stands your business out from your competition. And so Squarespace makes building a website really easy and very quick. You have tons of templates to choose from and customize them to perfectly fit your brand and what it is you do. And as well, tons of built-in tools like e-commerce, email marketing, appointment scheduling to give you a super professional and super easy to use website. I'm personally working on a secret project and I've been using Squarespace, and I have to admit it's very easy and actually very fun to use. So be sure to check out Squarespace at www.squarespace.com/Jimmy the Giant. And to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain, use the code Jimmy the Giant. Anyway, back to the video.
Wholesale squatting in luxury flats and hotels turns the spotlight on a still desperate housing situation.
On the 8th of September 1946 in central London. By now, the communists had tied themselves heavily into the world of squatting, despite the fact that the squatters weren't really supporters of communism. But regardless, these communist radicals had created a plan called the Great Sunday Squat, whereby the Communist Party moved over 100 families into luxury apartments in central London. You see, these apartments were used as offices during the wartime, and rather controversially were just given to Conservative MPs, who were allowed to keep them for themselves, where the argument was they were supposed to or could have been used for public housing. The government was now under pressure. They feared a spread of further rebellious squatters, and so they arrested 5 leaders of the Communist Party. They arrested them under the offence of conspiracy to trespass.
Now meet the man with a few words to say and the police who took him along for a quiet talk.
The Great Sunday Squat completely changed the British public's attitude towards squatting. It was seen as countercultural and an active rebellion against the state.
They thought they could snub the conventions of decent society when they seized the 60-room mansion and transformed it into a hippie house.
Toward the end of the 60s and into the 70s, a brand new, even more radical era of squatting would begin with the hippie movement. These large squats would open specifically to get media attention, with a mansion on 144 Piccadilly in central London, the Eel Pie Island Hotel, the Centre Point Building, and Freestonia. A new radicalist wave of squatters had formed, who were actually creating a rift between the original squatters, who were mainly families trying to just get some housing, whereby now these radicalist squatters weren't ex-military families. They were more so young single people, and were all pretty much self-proclaimed hippie dropouts.
The public had sympathy for the genuine homeless, but not for the scoundrels and hellraisers who infiltrated number 144, overshadowing the cause of the real homeless and doing them a disservice.
They also didn't believe that squatters should try and seek to make agreements with local councils. They believed that the squatting association should be able to seize the property and actually become the landlord, which surprisingly, people weren't a fan of. Not only was there a change in attitude amongst squatters, but in 1977 there was a change in the law which actually empowered the squatters. Section 6 of the Criminal Law Act of 1977 was created to stop landlords from evicting tenants unfairly onto the street, by making it an offence for the landlord to break into the property forcefully. Instead, they would need to go to court and make a case to get them out. However, this created a legal loophole, and you would start to see squatters actually putting Section 6 notices on the front of the house that they occupy. And you might be there wondering, why couldn't police just come in and evict them for trespassing? Well, you see, in the UK, trespass is a civil offence and not a criminal one. In order for police to be able to evict squatters, you would need to take them to a court to get permission from a judge to get the police to kick them out. And this process could take months and cost tons of money. Meanwhile, you got a bunch of squatters shooting up drugs in your house and destroying the place. And so this legal loophole became known as squatters' rights. Squatters were now protected by the law.
what they lack in grey matter between the ears, they make up for in colour on top.
Throughout the 80s into the 90s and 2000s, many notable squats had opened up, and the public sentiment towards squatters was now very much against them. Constant stories of people's homes being ruined by squatters, who were known for using drugs, having loud parties, requiring endless legal battles to try and evict them out of the property. And what's even more shocking is there would be cases of people actually losing their homes to squatters legally, whereby somehow in British law, if you've spent 10 to 12 years squatting a property, you now had a legal case for ownership of that property. This is the country I live in. By the late 2000s, the public sentiment was growing so much against squatting that someone would need to come along and do something. In steps Mike Weatherly.
I think there are two types of squatters. Some who are just like anarchists who don't care about other people's property, and I think those should be held to account.
A British Conservative MP for Hove in East Sussex, Mike made it his life's mission to get rid of squatters' rights. And so around the early 2010s, a war had started between the MPs and squatters. There was a fierce battle and protesters were going after Mike, but squatters were really going against the tide. No one was on the side of squatters. And so eventually in September 2012, a law was passed making it illegal to squat in residential properties. In that same year, Alex Hay became the first ever convicted squatter, facing 12 weeks in prison. It was finally over. The plague of squatters were done. But you see, something is missing from this story. The image that was being portrayed of squatters was that of a criminal freeloader. But was that entirely true? Mike Weatherly himself recognised that there are two types of squatters.
There are some who are just like anarchists who don't care about other people's property.
Where he would make the distinction between the anarchist freeloading type,
and there are others that are in need, and we should absolutely get behind them and help them in their plight.
But then also people driven into squatting via poverty. And there certainly is a moral argument to be made whether it's right to have buildings unoccupied for many years at a time when there's people who are living on the streets who could be living in them. As it stands right now, Section 6, otherwise known as squatters' rights, still applies to commercial properties, which I think there is more of an argument for. If you have an office block that hasn't been used for 7 or 8 years, I don't really think it's a bad thing that homeless people can go and live in there.
She could look through the window and all her mother's possessions were being ripped up and her embroidery thrown around and everything was being destroyed, and they couldn't do anything about it. And they broke down in tears in front of me and said, this cannot be right. And it took them, I think, 10 weeks and £13,000 to get their property back.
But the thing that I and the rest of the British public hated was the idea of going into residential properties. It was very wrong, and it's very good that that is now over. But I think it is very important not to stereotype a squatter and just see them as drug-taking hippies, and understand that there are many other circumstances that might lead someone to being a squatter. I'd be very curious to hear you guys' thoughts on squatting, whether you think it's right or wrong. So comment below, leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel, and watch this video right here.